Hey guys, so my first video is going to be on a part of the scientific method part of the Year 11 course. And this part is variables, and this is a really easy part to get marks on in your exam, because literally it's just one sentence that you have to memorize and write down, and then you'll either get the mark for it or you won't. So basically, to start off, let me clear this page. What is a variable? That's the first question we have to ask. So a variable is basically any factor that may change during an experiment. So I'll write that down just in case you want to stop it and stuff. So this definition sort of speaks for itself. Any factor, so for example, temperature, anything you're using in the experiment. For example, you're using dyes for a certain reason. If you're changing the dye, if you're changing the sun rays, any factor that may change during an experiment. So now that we've got that down, we can start to look at what are the three most important types that they'll ask in your exam. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the independent variable. So this is where people get confused. But the actual definition of independent variable is the factor that is being investigated, the one that is deliberately changed for some reason to investigate its effect. So to investigate the effect that it has on something else because you've changed something. So I like to think about it as though this is independent of the experiment. So it's the one that is being investigated. So this is the one that you are changing. So another word for this one is called the experimental variable, or the manipulated one, because this is the one that you're changing on purpose. So yep, so the other one that is in question is the dependent . So I generally have little ways of thinking about things, even sometimes if they're a little bit silly. And it's just basically to trigger your mind and say, oh yeah, like I remember that thing because of the silly thing that I was thinking about at that time. So the way I remember dependent variable, which is actually the one that has changed in a response to the change that you made in the independent. So the way I used to think about it when I was in high school was, oops, damn it. The factor or the variable that you are dependent on to change. For the experiment to be worth it, because you're changing the independent variable. So you basically do an experiment to find out what's going to happen. So the dependent variable is the one that changes because you change something. Sorry for the messy writing. So yeah, the dependent variable is the one that we are dependent on to change. So it's the one that changes in response to a change that you've already made via the independent one. So yeah, so those are the two hardest to differentiate between, but if you can remember that little rule that I said about the dependent, then generally you're fine. So now I want to show you the next type, which is the easiest one, I feel like. So it's the controlled. And generally sometimes in human by the words, if you are really stuck in your exam, just look at the word and then you'll be able to sometimes maybe piece it together even though you're not really sure, like you can have a good guess. So control variable, obviously it's the one that you control. So for example, if you were doing an experiment on which ice cube melts the fastest and they were exactly the same size, that's a controlled variable. The exact same size. So that's one controlled variable. Another controlled variable would be the temperature, because if you have one with a temperature of like 100 degrees Celsius and then the other of like negative 40, you're not going to see if it's not fair. So that can be a controlled variable. You want it at the exact same temperature if you're basing your experiment on something else. So yeah, there's a whole different bunch like of controlled variables. You just got to make sure. Basically, you've got to think about what would make your experiment fair in the exact situation of the specific experiment that you were doing. And the last one I wanted to talk about is uncontrolled. Let me just, here we go. So an uncontrolled variable, let me just write that down. It's the exact same thing, so you can even see it in the word. So obviously it's uncontrolled. It's one that you don't have any control over. So sometimes this can be because the person that is undertaking the experiment is just actually doesn't see that they need to control that variable. So that's one case. So they don't see or don't realize. And then in other cases, it might be because, for example, it's impossible, literally impossible to control something. For example, you can't control, let's say, the density of a liquid, or you can't control what exact temperature it's going to be outside, or the exact wind conditions or something like that. So those are the two ways they can be uncontrolled. So yeah, I hope you liked my little explanation of variables. And get the marks that you need in these little easy topics. Cool. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you stay tuned for more.